Ladies and gentlemen, brace yourselves. The curtain of the Silver Age is about to rise, but not to reveal the genteel poetry of the salon or the graceful steps of the ballet. We are venturing behind the scenes into the chilling St. Petersburg twilight, where the glitter of diamonds only served to highlight the depths of moral ruin, and the clinking of champagne glasses could not drown out the whisper of impending tragedy. Before you, a story will unfold that is often told with caution. It is the tale of a dazzling and defiant woman whose life was like a firework, brilliant, provocative, and doomed to an abrupt, deafening darkness. Forget everything you might have heard about this notorious case. Forget the dry lines of police reports and the yellowed clippings of old newspapers. We will descend into the very epicenter of human passion, where love and obsession, wealth and humiliation were tangled in a knot so tight that only the icy hand of fate could unravel it. This is not merely a chronicle of a sensational crime. This is an anatomy of a soul, a dissection of the myth of the Queen of Diamonds, whose fall from grace was far more complex and ambiguous than history would have you believe. Prepare to learn the price that was paid for a life without limits, and what truly transpired in that silent St. Petersburg bedroom when the last of the lights went out. Maria, born in 1886, was the single blossom in the garden of the wealthy Tsarskoye Selo merchant Tolstinskaya. Her childhood, spent under the protective canopy of her father's capital, promised a predictable and respectable path. A favorable marriage, the role of a venerable matron, a quiet and prosperous life bound by the strictures of society. But fate, that great trickster, had entirely different plans for her. When her father abruptly departed this world, leaving the young Maria with a colossal fortune, the steel corset of pre-revolutionary convention shattered into pieces. With her father gone, the last force capable of reining in her rebellious spirit had vanished. Her mother, the merchant's widow, tried to guide her daughter toward a righteous path, but their worlds had already drifted irrevocably apart. Their relationship devolved into a cold war between two eras, and Maria, unwilling to play by anyone else's rules, did something unthinkable for a young woman of her station. She simply packed her bags and moved out, not to a convent, not to live with relatives, but into her own apartment, to become the absolute master of her fate and her fortune. It was then, alone with limitless freedom and chests brimming with rubles, that Maria formulated her own daring manifesto. She craved a celebration that would never end, a whirlwind of emotion, a cascade of amusements, and the intoxicating feeling that the entire world lay at her feet. She began to live as if each day were her last, greedily sampling every forbidden fruit that the roaring city of St. Petersburg had to offer. At the tender age of 17, when her peers were dreaming of ball gowns and suitors, Maria found a far more thrilling diversion. She took a lover, a powerful dark-skinned athlete and tightrope walker, whose performances in the homes of the wealthy were as much an act of provocation as his appearance on the arm of a merchant's daughter. This was not just a romance, it was a challenge thrown in the face of polite society. Tragically, the union was short-lived. The artist caught a chill and soon faded away, leaving Maria with her first taste of loss and, it would seem, a permanent thirst for the unconventional. His death did not chasten her, it only whetted her appetites. Maria plunged into a life without restraint, transforming her existence into a perpetual masquerade. Her apartment became a stage for the most audacious performances, and the list of her admirers was staggering. On one hand, it included respectable gray-haired gentlemen, industrialists and bankers whose wallets were as tight as their moral principles. Maria saw no shame in accepting their lavish gifts and financial support, skillfully multiplying her father's inheritance with the fruits of their weakness. On the other hand, her home was always open to rowdy crowds of bohemians, artists, and, of course, other exotic cavaliers for whom she seemed to have an irresistible weakness. Into this vortex of passion, a daughter was born. The child was raised in the middle of a never-ending party, under the care of a nanny who said nothing of the decadent lifestyle and the unseemly company kept within the house. But the most astonishing thing was that Maria didn't just live as she pleased, she did it demonstratively for all to see. She reveled in her scandalous reputation, as if deliberately fanning the flames of neighborhood gossip. The windows of her apartment were almost never curtained, allowing curious eyes to watch the wild parties, the dancing, and the intimate scenes that were staged in her living room as if on a theater proscenium. Neighbors wrote complaints, the building manager threw up his hands, and the police offered only polite reminders about the norms of decency. But for Maria, no norms existed beyond her own desires. She was her own law, her own morality, the sovereign of a small but very loud universe that revolved solely around her pleasure. And it was this blind faith in her own impunity that was leading her directly to a fateful encounter, one destined to bring this mad spectacle to a close. To understand the drama of Maria Tolstinskaya, one must first understand the place that became her stage and ultimately her scaffold. This place was not an aristocratic salon or a quiet drawing room, but the thundering, glittering, and utterly debauched American skating rink. It was a child of the new 20th century, an era of speed, electricity, and the mingling of all social classes in one roiling cauldron. The very idea of roller skating, an import from the West, seemed to embody progress and audacious fun. It was new, fashionable, and accessible not only to the elite, but to anyone with enough silver jingling in their pocket to afford a ticket. The skating rink became a temple of idleness, a magnet for those seeking thrills and an escape from the gray saint. Petersburg routine into a world of artificial light, loud music, and dizzying motion. Picture a vast, echoing hall where hundreds of gaslights blazed from a vaulted ceiling, their glow fracturing and playing across a perfectly smooth wooden floor. The air was electric with noise, laughter, and the ceaseless hum of 1,000 tiny wheels. At the center of this chaos, on a raised platform, an orchestra blared out fiery ragtimes and fashionable waltzes, setting the rhythm for the endless gyre of bodies. Here, on this polished arena, a great social sacrament took place. Respectable merchants, casting aside their solemnity, wobbled to keep their balance. Dashing students and officers in smart uniforms sped past them, and bored high society ladies, shrieking with a mix of delight and fear, clung trustingly to the arms of hired instructors. It was a human kaleidoscope, where for a moment all boundaries blurred, and the only measure of status was the ability to glide gracefully across the floor. However, the skating rink was more than just a place to skate. Along the perimeter, on second-floor galleries, cozy tables were arranged where waiters moved silently, delivering iced champagne and light refreshments. Here, one could catch one's breath, observe the skaters, and, most importantly, make a useful acquaintance. The steep price of admission served as an invisible but effective barrier, filtering out the street poor and turning the rink into an exclusive club for those who could afford to pay for illusion. It was the perfect venue for business negotiations, society gossip, and, of course, amorous intrigues. At one table, the fate of a multi-thousand-ruble deal might be decided, while at the next, a secret rendezvous was being arranged. The fun on the floor was merely a beautiful screen for another life, one hidden from prying eyes. And as the twilight deepened outside, the dark side of this temple of amusement became ever more apparent. For the most private conversations and meetings, there were separate, heavily curtained booths where one could retreat into the semi-darkness. Gradually, the venue became a haunt for individuals of dubious reputation, card sharps, fortune hunters, and figures from the criminal underworld who found the noisy crowd to be the perfect camouflage. Ladies of flexible morals found generous patrons here, while blackmailers and swindlers scouted for victims among the tipsy elite. The skating rink's reputation soured over time, but its popularity only grew. It became a place where, behind a facade of respectable leisure, a veritable marketplace of human passions and vices thrived. And it was into this vortex that our heroine, Maria Tolstinskaya, threw herself headlong. For her, this place was not just entertainment, it was her element. For Maria Tolstinskaya, the skating rink was not merely a favorite pastime, it was a one-woman theater where she was the prima donna, the director, and the main subject of gossip. She did not merely skate, she reigned. Every one of her appearances was a carefully orchestrated performance, designed for maximum effect. She would burst into this buzzing hive of revelry like an exotic comet, commanding every gaze. She dressed on the verge of kitsch, choosing the brightest, almost garish outfits made from expensive fabrics that accentuated her figure and made her stand out from the crowd. But her primary weapon, her calling card, was her diamonds. She wore them from head to toe like a suit of armor glittering in the gaslight. Expensive necklaces coiled around her throat, massive bracelets shackled her wrists, and earrings of such a size dangled from her lobes that they resembled miniature chandeliers. It was even rumored that her skating boots were adorned with precious buckles. Soon, a nickname stuck to her, the Queen of Diamonds. This was not simply a love of luxury, it was a calculated act of self-assertion. She wanted everyone to see, to know, and to envy her wealth and independence. Her skating style was as audacious as her attire. She flew around the rink with reckless abandon, often quite drunk, yet somehow managed to maintain her balance. Between dizzying laps, Maria would invariably take a table in the gallery and drain glass after glass of iced champagne, generously treating her entourage. A swarm of admirers constantly surrounded her, drawn by the sparkle of her jewels and the rumors of her generosity. She flirted with abandon, changing partners like gloves, and it was here, in the intoxicating atmosphere of revelry, that she found most of her fleeting paramours. The skating rink was her ideal hunting ground, a place where she didn't have to hide her desires or observe proprieties, but could simply take what she wanted without a thought for the consequences. Maria reveled in the power she held over men, a power granted by her money and a complete lack of inhibition. She was a predator in glittering scales, and the entire noisy, colorful crowd was merely a backdrop for her triumph. But even the brightest stars need someone to orbit. To attract the public, especially the ladies, the rink's management maintained a staff of professional instructors. These were not just teachers, they were the stars of the rink, its gladiators. They were selected according to strict criteria: youth, strength, beauty, and, of course, flawless skating ability. They received a handsome salary and enjoyed immense popularity with the female clientele. For many wealthy and bored ladies, a visit to the rink was just a pretext to hire one of these athletes, and during the lesson, experience the raw pleasure of proximity to a nimble, handsome man. As the society columns of the day put it, these young men were living commodities, objects of desire, and they understood the rules of the game perfectly. One of the most striking members of this cast was Albert Tunis. Fate had thrown this 23-year-old, the son of a poor Moldavian peasant family, into the heart of the imperial capital, and he seized his chance with a death grip. Albert was Maria's polar opposite. Where she had been given everything at birth, he had fought for every step, relying only on his muscles and natural charm. Before joining the rink, he had worked as a messenger and a shop clerk, earning a reputation everywhere as a responsible and exceptionally hard-working man. But his true talent was his beauty. Tall and well-built, with classic features and the body of a Greek god, he seemed sculpted for admiration. On the rink, he moved with the grace of a predatory animal, effortless, confident, powerful. Women swooned at his glance, and the waiting list for his lessons was booked for weeks. He was polite and obliging, but carried himself with a dignity that kept the line between flirtation and familiarity from being crossed. And then, one ordinary evening, the gaze of the Queen of Diamonds, scanning the crowd, fell upon him. In that moment, two opposites, two worlds that should never have intersected, hurtled toward each other with the inevitability of runaway trains. In that state, flushed with movement and champagne, she would scan the crowd for her next partners, and this time, her predatory, appraising gaze settled on a figure who was an alien element in this world of idleness. The rink's management, seeking to attract the wealthiest clientele, kept a full staff of professional instructors on a high salary. These were not just teachers. They were true gladiators of the rink, living Apollos on roller skates. Their job was not only to help clumsy novices master the art of skating, but also to serve as the living decor of the establishment. Young, strong, athletically built, handsome men in form-fitting suits, they were the object of secret sighs and explicit fantasies for many a bored lady. There was a special forbidden allure to their services, the chance to feel the proximity of a nimble, muscular male body from another, simpler, rougher world. It was a titillating amusement, a brief, safe brush with the untamed, for which aristocrats and merchants' wives paid handsomely. Among these professional tempters, one stood out, his beauty not of the refined metropolitan sort, but something primal and natural. His name was Albert Tunis, a 23-year-old from a poor Moldavian peasant family. He possessed a strength and stature inherited from ancestors who had worked the land. Tall, broad-shouldered, with a shock of dark hair and piercing eyes, he moved with the grace of a wild beast, swift and sure. Fate had brought him to St. Petersburg in search of a better life, and before landing at the rink, he had worked several jobs: a messenger in an office, a clerk in a shop, and everywhere he was described as exceptionally hard-working, honest, and diligent. He was not yet corrupted by city life. You could still sense in him that peasant groundedness and simplicity that set him so favorably apart from the slick city dandies. The ladies were mad for him, and many came to the rink solely to hire him as their instructor. That evening, Maria saw in him more than just another handsome male. She saw perfect material, a blank canvas upon which her domineering nature could paint whatever it desired. His strength and youth were a challenge to her jaded senses, and his obvious poverty was a guarantee of his future submission. She summoned him to her table. For Albert, accustomed to coy smiles and suggestive glances, the encounter with the Queen of Diamonds was a shock. Before him sat a woman enveloped in an aura of money, power, and vice. Her direct, almost masculine gaze left no doubt as to her intentions, and when she smiled and asked him for a lesson, it sounded less like a request than a command. On the rink, holding her by the waist, feeling the heat of her body through the thin fabric of her dress, Albert felt a dizzying mix of fear and exhilaration. He was a pawn who had suddenly found himself at the center of a queen's game, a game that promised either untold riches or total annihilation. Thus began their affair, swift, feverish, and from the very first day, poisoned by inequality. Maria did not court him. She bought him, showering him with gifts that both dazzled and degraded. Expensive watches, silk shirts, gold cufflinks, each present was another step toward his enslavement. She fell for him with all the passion of her insatiable nature, but it was the love of a proprietor, the love of a capricious deity for its creation. She demanded total submission, adoration, and his undivided attention every second of every day. Albert, blinded by the glitter of luxury and intoxicated by his proximity to such a woman, was at first on cloud nine. To a simple boy like him, it seemed he had drawn a winning lottery ticket, that fortune itself had smiled upon him. He did not yet understand that this smile was a predatory snarl, and that the golden cage he was being so gently lured into was about to slam shut. The idyll, however, was short-lived. The sweet delirium of the first few weeks dissipated, replaced by a harsh, suffocating reality. Maria's predatory nature, previously masked by infatuation, revealed itself in its full destructive force. Her passion twisted into total control, her love into a morbid obsession. She began to resent Albert's every interaction, every casual smile he offered to clients at the rink. She subjected him to ugly, public scenes, accusing him of all manner of sins without a care for who was watching. The very thought that her lover, her property, belonged to anyone else, even for the few hours of his workday, was unbearable to her. She gave him an ultimatum, cloaked in the guise of concern. Why should he demean himself working for others when he had her? She promised him full financial support, mountains of gold, a life beyond his wildest dreams. All he had to do in return was quit his job and belong only to her. Albert, not yet fully comprehending the trap he was in, agreed. He resigned from the rink, losing not only a well-paying job, but the last thread connecting him to his former independent life. The day he collected his final wages, the door of the golden cage clanged shut behind him. His new life was brilliant on the outside and monstrously humiliating within. Maria dragged him everywhere with her, to restaurants, theaters, receptions, not as an equal partner, but as a beautiful toy, an exotic trophy. She would proudly introduce him to her acquaintances, but her voice always carried a note of superiority. In her inner circle, she unabashedly called him her page boy. He was her shadow, her silent companion, obligated to anticipate and fulfill her every whim. Meanwhile, the financial arrangement of their union was a cruel joke. For personal expenses, for cigarettes and other trifles, the Queen of Diamonds gave her favorite exactly 1 ruble a day, a sum barely sufficient to keep him from feeling like a complete pauper. Albert's position was further complicated by the fact that he was not the only man in her life. Alongside their turbulent affair, Maria continued her relationship with one of her wealthy, elderly patrons. She didn't even try to hide it, as if deliberately demonstrating to Albert his true subordinate place in her complex hierarchy of pleasures. He was neither a husband nor a primary lover, but something akin to a court jester, whose duty was to entertain and please his mistress. Maria herself seemed to derive a perverse pleasure from watching his dependency. She liked to believe that this handsome young man endured all the humiliation purely out of his boundless love for her. She deluded herself with the fantasy that his feelings were so strong he was willing to sacrifice his pride, his freedom, and his honor for her sake. Soon, the very thing that had brought them together, the skating rink, bored her. Maria lost all interest in skating and threw herself into a new obsession, the gambling game of lotto, spending her nights in gaming clubs. Albert waited. He waited for her whim to pass, for the promised mountains of gold to finally materialize, for his humiliating status to change. But time went on, and his situation only worsened. His debts grew, and 1 ruble a day was catastrophically insufficient. At some point, desperation drove him to a reckless act. He secretly took a pair of expensive diamond earrings from Maria's jewelry box, pawned them, and used the money to pay off his creditors. The theft was, of course, discovered. But Maria's reaction was unexpected. Instead of throwing him out in disgrace, she staged a scene of magnanimous forgiveness. She forgave him, but in the same breath banished him from her apartment to a cheap nearby hotel, making him even more dependent on her. Now he had to wait to be summoned like a dog awaiting its master's command. The drama's conclusion was inevitable, and it struck like a thunderbolt from a clear sky. One morning, a maid entered Maria Tolstinskaya's bedroom and found her lifeless in her own bed. The arriving doctor initially declared a heart attack, but a more thorough examination revealed faint, dark marks on her neck, the impressions of someone else's fingers. All the money and the famous diamonds were missing from the apartment, and soon the police received a report. 2 men, Albert Greychunas and his brother, had been detained at the Prussian border while attempting to cross illegally. Their suitcase contained a fortune. The investigation into the death of the Queen of Diamonds quickly morphed from a routine police inquiry into a full-blown public sensation. Newspapers vied to publish every new detail, and with each passing day, a darker and more sordid underbelly emerged from beneath the glossy veneer of Maria Tolstinskaya's life. What was revealed to the investigators and the public was not simply the victim of a brutal crime, but a woman with a broken destiny and a warped soul. During the questioning of witnesses, servants, neighbors, acquaintances, facts surfaced that painted her portrait in the darkest of shades. Her lifestyle, which had once seemed merely provocative, now appeared as a series of deeply destructive and self-destructive acts. It became known that her addictions extended beyond alcohol to other, more potent substances that helped her maintain the feverish pace of her existence. But the most shocking blow to the deceased's reputation came from the medical examiner's report. Doctors discovered that Maria was suffering from an advanced form of that unpleasant illness known in polite society as the French disease. The diagnosis not only explained many of her behavioral oddities, the drastic mood swings, the fits of aggression, but also cast a sinister shadow over her relationship with Albert. It soon came to light that she, knowing of her condition, had deliberately infected him. This detail turned the entire case on its head. In the eyes of many, Albert Gray Chunas was transformed from a vulgar thief and a cold-blooded murderer into a victim, a man who had not just been humiliated and used, but slowly and methodically destroyed, both morally and physically. His act did not become any less horrific, but it now had a terrifying, almost infernal motive. When Gray Chunas himself, broken and defeated, began to testify, the picture of that fateful night emerged in all its ugly completeness. It was not a spontaneous burst of anger, but the culmination of a long, agonizing process of psychological torment. That evening, Maria had been in a particularly foul mood. She had summoned Albert and, fueled by champagne, treated him to one of her favorite performances. She demanded money from him, which he, of course, did not have, and then proposed that he earn it. What followed was like a waking nightmare. Laughing, she forced him, a strong young man, to get on all fours and act like a poodle, to bark and crawl on the carpet, begging for a handout. It was the apex of humiliation, the final drop that caused his cup of endurance to overflow. But even that was not enough for her. After this monstrous scene, she began, as if nothing had happened, to demand intimacy. Albert, hollowed out and crushed, refused. He had long felt nothing for her but a mixture of revulsion and fear. And then Maria flew into a rage. She began screaming that he was a nobody, that she had picked him up from the gutter and would send him right back there. She threatened to throw him onto the street, without money, without a job, branded as a thief and a kept man. She screamed that she would destroy him, grind him to dust, that he would regret defying her for the rest of his days. At that moment, according to Albert, something inside his head snapped. All the accumulated rage, all the pain, all the humiliation he had endured for months merged into a single, blind, uncontrollable impulse. He lunged at her, not to fulfill her demand, but to make her stop talking. Yet, for all the horror of what transpired, it would be naive to see Albert Gray Chunas solely as an innocent lamb driven to the edge by a demonic woman. The investigation in the court looked at the facts soberly, without sentimentality, and the picture they saw was far more complex and ambiguous. One could not forget how it all began. Albert, for all his rustic simplicity and work ethic, was no naive youth who had accidentally fallen into the web of a cunning seductress. From the very beginning, he understood perfectly well the game being offered and the stakes involved. He knowingly entered into a relationship with Maria, tempted by her wealth and the world of luxury she promised. His initial motive was clear and prosaic: money. He was a classic kept man, perhaps a novice and an unlucky one, but a kept man nonetheless, willing to trade his youth and freedom for a comfortable, carefree existence. His tragedy was not that he was deceived, but that he had overestimated himself. He thought he could play by her rules, reap the dividends, and still retain a shred of his own dignity, but he had miscalculated. Maria proved to be a much stronger, more ruthless, and more unpredictable player. She didn't just buy him. She demanded his soul as part of the bargain, something he had never anticipated. His situation was humiliating, but it was a humiliation he had entered into voluntarily in pursuit of an easy life. He was not a slave chained to his mistress. At any moment, he could have broken off the toxic relationship, walked out, and returned to his former life. Less glamorous, perhaps, but honest, he did not. He continued to cling to his ghostly chance at wealth, enduring the degradation in the hope of an eventual payoff. Moreover, the theft of the earrings spoke volumes about his true intentions. That act showed that when the game didn't go according to his script, he crossed the line into criminality without much hesitation. He didn't try to earn money to pay his debts. He simply took what wasn't his, believing he had some moral right to it. Therefore, when he took all the money and diamonds after the tragedy, it did not look like the spontaneous act of a terrified man, but rather the logical conclusion of his original plan. He came for money, and in the end, he got it, albeit at a terrible price. Public opinion might have sympathized with him. The jury might have considered mitigating circumstances, but the law was implacable. He was not merely a victim, he was a participant in this dirty game who, in the final act, decided to cash in, regardless of the means. He was a predator who had been caught in the trap of a larger, more dangerous beast, and in a desperate struggle for survival, he delivered a fatal blow. To the very end, he insisted in court that he had never planned to take her life. In his telling, that fateful night was a natural disaster, the eruption of a volcano that had long slumbered beneath a mountain of daily humiliations. He said that in the moment her insults and threats reached their peak, his reason clouded over. It was an uncontrollable fit of rage, the blind fury of a man pushed beyond his limits. He hadn't meant to strangle her. He had merely grabbed her by the throat and begun to shake her, trying to silence the torrent of venom. When he realized she had gone limp and was no longer breathing, he was seized by an icy terror. As for the stolen valuables, he had his own twisted logic for that as well. He was convinced that he had earned the money and diamonds that had caused his downfall. It was not theft in his mind, but a terrible, perverse compensation for his broken pride, his ruined health, and the months of slavery in which she had kept him. The court, having heard all sides, faced a difficult dilemma. On one hand, a grave crime had been committed, a human life had been taken, and the perpetrator had attempted to flee with the spoils. The defense's plea for a full acquittal was flatly rejected. Albert Gray Tunis was not innocent. But on the other hand, the jury could not ignore the abyss of provocation, torment, and psychological violence into which Maria Tolstinskaya had systematically plunged her lover. Her behavior was deemed exceptionally cruel and became the primary mitigating factor. In the end, the verdict was a compromise between law and justice. Albert was found guilty of taking a life in a state of sudden and intense emotional distress, passion, and agitation. The sentence, 6 years of hard labor. By the standards of the time for such a crime, it was an astonishingly lenient punishment. Lady Justice, though blindfolded, had managed to see that there were two actors in this tragedy, and the blame did not lie entirely with one. What more is there to say? This story is not just a crime chronicle. It is a dark and cautionary tale about what passion becomes when it is stripped of respect, and about the terrible price paid for attempting to possess another human being like an object. Maria wanted to buy herself love, loyalty, and adoration, but she paid for them with humiliation and control. Albert dreamed of buying himself wealth and freedom, but he ended up selling himself into slavery. From the start, their union was not a romance, but the tragic finale of a toxic bargain, where each sought to deceive the other and, in the end, deceived only themselves. The story of Maria and Albert is a brutal reminder that when one person tries to buy the soul of another, the bill is eventually presented to both, and it is not paid with money alone.